The Williams family was the picture of happiness. Emily and Michael had always devoted their lives to their 10-year-old daughter, Ella. Their small family lived in a cozy suburban neighborhood filled with weekend trips to the park, movie nights, and laughter that echoed through the walls of their home. Ella was the light of their lives, a bright, bubbly child whose boundless energy and charm drew people to her effortlessly. Michael loved to spoil her with adventures, while Emily ensured their days were filled with warmth and love. Whether it was baking cookies together or reading bedtime stories, Emily believed in creating memories that Ella would carry forever. Teachers adored Ella for her curious mind and cheerful demeanor, while her friends loved her imaginative games. To everyone who knew her, Ella was the heart of her family and the star of her community. But even the brightest stars can face sudden darkness. It started with a complaint, a small stomachache that Ella mentioned over dinner one evening. "It's probably something you ate," Emily had said, brushing it off with a reassuring smile. But by the next morning, Ella was quiet, her chatter replaced by a troubling silence. Days passed, and her once boundless energy seemed to drain away. Emily began noticing Ella clutching her stomach more often, wincing when she moved. Then one morning, as Emily helped her daughter get dressed, she froze. There it was, a small, firm bulge protruding from Ella's abdomen. "What's this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ella looked down, her face a mixture of confusion and innocence. "I don't know," she mumbled. Fear gripped Emily's heart as she called Michael into the room. When he saw it, his face went pale. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, grabbing his keys. The drive was silent, tension thick in the air. Ella, who usually filled car rides with endless stories, sat quietly in the back seat. Emily clenched her hands together, praying silently for this to be something minor. A cyst, a simple infection, anything but what her darkest fears whispered. At the hospital, nurses ushered them into a room quickly. Blood tests and scans were ordered. Emily and Michael sat in the waiting room, holding hands tightly as their imaginations conjured worst-case scenarios. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours until a doctor finally approached. The doctor's face was grave. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sympathy. Emily's heart raced. "What's wrong with her?" The doctor hesitated before speaking. "Ella está embarazada." The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Emily blinked, unable to process it. Michael gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. "She's 10, he stammered. "This has to be a mistake." The doctor shook his head. "The tests are conclusive." Emily felt the room spin around her. Her innocent, sweet little girl, pregnant. She couldn't fathom it. Who had done this to her daughter? How had this happened? Michael's voice broke the silence, filled with fury. "Who? Who did this to her?" "We don't know yet," the doctor replied carefully. "But right now we need to focus on Ella's health." Emily barely heard the rest of what the doctor said. Her mind was a blur of questions, fears, and overwhelming grief. Her perfect family was shattering before her eyes, and there were no answers to hold it together. The days that followed were a nightmare. Emily and Michael were consumed by a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, and guilt. How could they have missed the signs? How could this have happened under their watch? Ella, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, continued to play with her toys and chatter about her favorite cartoons, as if nothing had changed. Her innocence only deepened her parents' despair. Emily blamed herself endlessly for not protecting Ella, while Michael's anger simmered, barely contained. "She doesn't even understand what's happening," Emily whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. Michael sat in silence, his fists clenched tightly. "Someone hurt her," he finally said, his voice low but seething. "And I'm going to find out who." Their search for answers began within their tight-knit community. They questioned everyone who had been around Ella in recent months, teachers, neighbors, family, friends. But no one seemed suspicious. Ella's cheerful innocence had shielded her from their suspicions. "Who did this to you, sweetie?" Emily asked gently one evening, sitting beside Ella on her bed. Ella looked up from her coloring book, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No one, Mommy," she said softly. "Nobody hurt me." Emily's heart broke all over again. How could Ella not know? Or was she too afraid to tell the truth? Michael, overhearing the conversation, stormed out of the room, his frustration boiling over. They pushed for DNA tests, hoping they would provide clarity. Every male in Ella's life, from teachers to the neighbor down the street, was tested. But the results came back negative for all of them. "How is that even possible?" Michael muttered, pacing the kitchen. "It's like it happened out of thin air." Emily sat at the table, her hands trembling. "What if we're looking in the wrong place?" she whispered, barely able to voice her thoughts. But the answer would come in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, while Michael was paying bills in the living room, Ella sat on the floor, playing with her dolls. She placed one doll on top of another in an unusual way, catching Michael's attention. "What are you doing, sweetie?" he asked, his voice calm but his stomach tightening. "They're playing a game," Ella replied, smiling. "What kind of game?" Michael pressed, his voice faltering. "The game I play with Ethan," Ella said innocently, positioning the dolls again. Michael froze. Ethan, the boy next door, was Ella's age. They often played together, their laughter ringing out from the yard. Michael's mind raced as the pieces started falling into place. "Ella," he said carefully, his voice trembling. "What do you mean by this game? What did you and Ethan do?" Ella looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "We just played, Daddy. Like this." Michael's blood ran cold. Rage and disbelief gripped him as he realized what had happened. Ethan, another child, not some faceless adult, was at the center of their nightmare. Without a word, Michael stormed out of the house, his mind consumed by fury. Ethan's family needed to answer for what their son had done. Michael's knuckles turned white as he pounded on the door of Ethan's house. His mind was a storm of anger and disbelief. Each knock echoed in his ears, fueled by the image of his innocent daughter and the truth he had just uncovered. The door swung open to reveal David, Ethan's father, his face creased with confusion. "Michael, what's—" Michael grabbed David by the collar, shoving him back against the doorframe. "What did your son do to my daughter?" he demanded, his voice low but brimming with rage. David's wife, Sarah, appeared in the doorway, alarm flashing across her face. "What's going on?" she stammered. "Your son," Michael growled, shaking David. "Ella told me. She showed me what they did. Ethan did this to her. He's the father of her child." David's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "That's impossible," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not impossible," Michael shouted, his voice cracking. "You let this happen. How could you not know what your son was doing?" "Michael, stop," a voice called out from behind him. Emily rushed up the walkway, her face pale with worry. She had been alerted by a neighbor who saw Michael storming over and feared the worst. "This isn't helping." Michael turned to her, his expression filled with pain. "They need to answer for this," he said through clenched teeth. "We don't even know if it's true," Sarah interjected, her voice trembling. "Ethan is just a child. How could he even understand what he was doing?" Emily placed her hand on Michael's arm, trying to calm him. "We need to confirm the truth," she said softly. "A DNA test is the only way." David hesitated, his gaze darting between Michael and Emily. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll do the test, but if it comes back negative, you'll owe us an apology." "And if it's positive," Michael said coldly, "there won't be enough apologies in the world to make this right." The days leading up to the DNA test were a blur of tension and dread. Both families avoided each other, each drowning in their own sea of guilt, fear, and blame. For Michael, the weight was unbearable. He spent his nights pacing the house, replaying every moment in his mind, searching for signs he had missed. Emily, on the other hand, buried herself in caring for Ella, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. David and Sarah faced their own torment. Ethan's confusion and silence about the situation only deepened their fears. Sarah cried herself to sleep most nights, clutching a photo of Ethan as a baby. "He's still my little boy," she whispered to David one evening. "How could this happen? What did we do wrong? When the day of the results arrived, both families gathered at the clinic. The room was cold and sterile, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Ella sat beside Emily, her small hands fidgeting nervously. Across the room, Ethan slouched in his chair, his face pale and expressionless. The doctor entered, holding an envelope. "I have the results," she said, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of the moment. Everyone held their breath as she opened the envelope and scanned the paper. "The DNA confirms that Ethan is the father of Ella's baby," she said. The room erupted. Michael shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You see? I told you!" he yelled, pointing at David and Sarah. "This is on you!" David's shoulders slumped, his face a mixture of shock and despair. "He's just a boy," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Sarah sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands. Ethan remained frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with fear. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Emily broke down, tears streaming down her face as she pulled Ella into her arms. "She's just a child," she whispered, over and over, as if saying it could undo the nightmare they were living. But the nightmare wasn't over. Ella's pregnancy was progressing faster than expected, and her small body was struggling to keep up. Just days after the DNA test, she was rushed to the hospital with severe complications. Michael and Emily sat in the waiting room, their hands clasped tightly together. David and Sarah arrived soon after, their faces pale and etched with guilt. For the first time since the ordeal began, there were no accusations, no blame, just a shared fear for Ella's life. Hours passed in agonizing silence until a nurse appeared, her expression grim. "Ella is stable for now," she said, "but the delivery will be risky. Her body is too small, and we're doing everything we can to keep her safe." The families exchanged hollow looks, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a heavy stone. They were no longer adversaries, but two sets of parents united by their love for their children and their shared hope for a miracle. As Ella was wheeled into the delivery room, Michael and Emily clung to each other, their silent prayers echoing in the sterile corridors. And as David and Sarah watched from the corner, their tears mirrored the same desperation. They could only wait and hope that Ella would emerge from this ordeal alive, and that somehow they could all find a way to heal. The sterile lights of the delivery room cast harsh shadows on the faces of the medical team working tirelessly around Ella. Machines beeped in a chaotic rhythm, and orders were barked in urgent tones. Emily and Michael stood just beyond the doors, their faces pale and hearts pounding. Emily clung to Michael's arm, her voice breaking as she whispered, "She's just a little girl. She shouldn't have to go through this." Michael didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his fists trembling with helplessness. The anger he had carried for weeks felt meaningless now. All that mattered was Ella, his little girl, fighting for her life inside that room. Meanwhile, David and Sarah sat in the waiting area, silent and pale. Ethan, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Inside the delivery room, Ella's condition worsened. Her small body was struggling to keep up with the demands of labor. Her heart rate dipped, alarms blared, and the medical team moved with heightened urgency. In the corner of the room, Ethan suddenly appeared. He had slipped past the nurses and stood frozen, his wide eyes fixed on Ella's frail form. "What are you doing here?" a nurse snapped, moving to escort him out. But Ethan darted forward, grabbing Ella's hand. "Please!" he cried, tears streaming down his face. "Don't leave me!" The medical staff hesitated. Ethan clutched her hand tightly, his small voice trembling as he spoke. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know. I just wanted to play. Ella, I'm so sorry. Please don't leave. I need you. We all need you." His voice cracked with desperation, and for a brief moment the chaos in the room seemed to pause. Ella's hand twitched in his grip, a faint movement that didn't go unnoticed by the nurses. "She's stabilizing," one of them called out, her voice filled with cautious hope. Ethan's plea had sparked something in Ella, perhaps a flicker of strength or a will to hold on. The medical team resumed their work with renewed focus. Hours later, the ordeal reached its climax. A piercing cry broke the tension as the baby entered the world, followed by the sound of Ella's labored but steady breathing. The doctor emerged from the delivery room, his face weary but calm. "She's stable," he said. "Ella made it through. The baby is healthy." Relief washed over the families like a wave. Emily collapsed into Michael's arms, sobbing with gratitude. David and Sarah clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. Hours later, the families were allowed into Ella's recovery room. She lay pale and exhausted, her fragile body a stark reminder of how close they had come to losing her. In a small bassinet beside her, the newborn baby slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil surrounding his arrival. Emily sat at Ella's bedside, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice filled with pride and sorrow. Michael stood at a distance, his gaze fixed on the baby. The tiny child, so innocent and unaware, was now a symbol of their fractured lives. He approached the bassinet and hesitated before reaching down to gently pick him up. "What's his name?" Michael asked softly, turning to Emily. She glanced at David and Sarah, who stood silently near the door. "We should all decide together," Emily said, her voice steady but kind. After a moment of quiet deliberation, Sarah spoke up. "Oliver," she suggested. "It's a strong name, a name that represents hope." Michael nodded. "Oliver it is." For the first time since the nightmare began, there was a flicker of unity between the two families. As the days passed, they found themselves in the same hospital room more often, caring for Ella and Oliver together. Ethan visited frequently, sitting quietly by Ella's side, his guilt still visible in his small, slouched frame. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered one day, his voice trembling. Ella reached out and took his hand, her voice weak but steady. "I know," she said simply. Their exchange was brief but powerful, a moment of forgiveness that echoed louder than words. Both families knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. They agreed on one thing. Neither Ella nor Ethan could bear the burden of parenthood. Oliver would be raised by Emily and Michael, but David and Sarah pledged to remain involved. "This isn't just about him," Emily said one evening, holding Oliver close. "It's about healing, for all of us." Michael, once consumed by anger, had softened. Watching the baby in his arms, he realized that Oliver wasn't a symbol of their pain, but a chance to rebuild. "We have to let go of the blame," Michael said, his voice steady. "For Ella, for Ethan, and for Oliver." David nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "We'll do it together." The families began to rebuild their relationship, finding strength in their shared commitment to the children. Their once fractured bond slowly mended, piece by piece, as they worked toward a future where Oliver could grow up surrounded by love and support. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined them. In their place was a fragile but hopeful truce, a promise to move forward, united by the new life they had been given. Life after Oliver's birth was anything but easy. Though the storm of emotions had calmed, its aftermath lingered like an unspoken weight. Both families were bound together by circumstances none of them had foreseen, and every interaction felt like treading on thin ice. Emily and Michael dedicated themselves to raising Oliver, their home transformed by the quiet presence of a newborn. The once lively house now echoed with the soft hum of lullabies and the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. Emily spent her nights by Oliver's crib, watching his tiny chest rise and fall, her love for him growing despite the pain that had brought him into the world. Michael, too, found solace in Oliver. Holding the baby in his arms, he felt the anger that had consumed him begin to fade. "He's innocent," Michael said one evening, his voice quiet but resolute. We owe it to him to give him a chance. David and Sarah, too, had begun to adapt. Though their visits to the Williams home were initially tense, they became more frequent. Sarah often brought small gifts for Oliver: soft blankets, tiny clothes, a handmade quilt she had spent weeks sewing. "I want him to know he's loved," she told Emily one day, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan's role in Oliver's life was more complicated. Too young to understand the full weight of his actions, he alternated between guilt and confusion. Yet, he found moments of clarity when he sat beside Ella, playing games or reading to her as she recovered. Ella, though still fragile, was resilient. The family's efforts to shield her from the darker aspects of the situation allowed her to focus on her recovery and the simple joys of childhood. "Is Oliver okay?" she asked one day, her voice soft but steady. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Ella's face. "He's perfect," she replied. Though unspoken, there was a shared understanding among the families. They had a long road ahead, but they were determined to walk it together. Months turned into a year, and the families settled into an uneasy rhythm. The wounds of the past had not healed entirely, but they had scabbed over, allowing room for something new: hope. Oliver grew quickly, his soft giggles filling the Williams home with a warmth that had once seemed impossible. He became a bridge between the two families, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, life could bring unexpected blessings. On a sunny afternoon, both families gathered at the park to celebrate Oliver's first birthday. It was a simple affair: balloons tied to picnic tables, a small cake decorated with a single candle. But it symbolized how far they had come. Ella and Ethan played together on the swings, their laughter ringing out across the park. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were just children again. Emily and Sarah sat together, watching their children and sharing quiet conversation. "It's still hard sometimes," Sarah admitted, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "But seeing them like this, it helps." Emily nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Oliver, who was crawling on a blanket nearby. "We've come a long way," she said, "and we'll keep going. For them." The men, too, had found common ground. Michael and David stood by the grill, their earlier animosity replaced by a tentative camaraderie. "I didn't think we'd ever get here," David said, flipping a burger. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Neither did I. But here we are." As the day drew to a close, the families gathered for the highlight of the celebration: Oliver's first steps. With everyone watching, he wobbled forward on unsteady legs, his tiny arms reaching out for support. The group erupted in cheers, their joy uniting them in a way words never could. In that moment, the past didn't matter. The pain, the anger, the blame, all of it faded in the face of a shared future. Later that evening, as the sun set and the families began to pack up, Ella approached Emily. "Mom," she said, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Yes, sweetheart? Are we going to be okay?" Emily knelt down, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time, Emily truly believed it. Years later, Oliver's laughter echoed through the Williams home, filling every corner with life. He had grown into a bright, happy boy, surrounded by love from both families. Michael and Emily raised him with care, ensuring he had the support and opportunities to thrive. David and Sarah remained a constant presence, their involvement a testament to the unity forged through shared hardship. Ella and Ethan, now older, had found their footing as siblings rather than parents to Oliver. They shared a unique bond with the boy, rooted in their shared journey and the innocence of their childhood. Through therapy, guidance, and love, they grew into kind, thoughtful teenagers, leaving the darkness of the past behind while carrying its lessons with them. On Oliver's 5th birthday, both families gathered once again, celebrating not just his life, but the resilience of their blended family. As the sun set over the yard, Michael raised a glass, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "To family," he said, looking around at the faces that had weathered so much together. "To forgiveness, and to the future." As they clinked glasses, laughter and hope filled the air, a reminder of how far they had come. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. What do you think about this powerful story of resilience and unity? Let's discuss in the comments below. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. See you next time.